that depending on where you join me from tonight, we are potentially gathered on the traditional lands of many peoples. For my workplace in Hobsons Bay, where many of you are likely joining us from tonight, I would like to acknowledge the peoples of the Kulin Nation and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. But I don't want to exclude all traditional owners whose lands we may be communally standing on this evening. So Council acknowledges that long before this area was known as Hobsons Bay, our First Nations people had named its places, had hosted ancient ceremonies where learning flourished, where knowledge and resources were exchanged, and healthy communities and relationships were sustained and adapted to the changing environments. We recognise the unique role that diverse Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from many lands have played and continue to play in the life of this city. We pay homage to that tonight, coming together to learn, to share, to sustain and to adapt. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I've already said we are going to record this, so it is up to you if you want to have your videos on. We are going to mute during the video just so that there's not any background sound happening and we get the best quality as possible. And we will have time for Q&A at the end. So during that time, please feel free to unmute yourself to ask your questions and then mute yourself again at the end. So tonight's event is being brought to you by Hobsons Bay Libraries and the EnviroCentre. I would like to let you know, if you haven't already heard, that all branches of Hobsons Bay Libraries are now reopened, and all branches are open between 2 and 6 Monday to Friday, with a special community hour between 1 and 2 o'clock for those people who could identify themselves as needing some extra assistance or a time that's quieter. And then also on a Saturday from 10 to 1. So tonight's event, though, is why we are all here, and climate change is an issue facing many of us, and we see from student strikes all around the world that the young people in our communities are grappling with these issues as well. Tonight's event is all about helping parents, guardians, grandparents, teachers know how to best to tackle the conversations that may come as a result of the young people in their life exploring these topics. Professor Ann Sanson joins us as our guest speaker today, and Anne is a developmental psychologist whose research has mainly focused on social and emotional psychology and the development from infancy to adulthood. Her current work focuses on the impact of the climate crisis on current and future generations of children. She's an Honorary Professorial Fellow at the University of Melbourne. So please join me in welcoming Anne.
Thank you, Melissa. Now I'm trying to share my screen. Why isn't it coming up? Because I haven't clicked on the right thing. And now I need to go to there. How's that? Can you all see that?
We can see that perfectly. Thanks, Anne.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Melissa, for that introduction and the welcome, and for organising this event. I'm very happy to be speaking with you today, and I hope I don't prattle on for too long so we have lots of time for discussion at the end. Feel free, Melissa, to tell me that I need to wind up, because I do get a bit excited and carry on a little bit too long. So thank you for that acknowledgement of country, Melissa. That was really, really nice. I'd like to acknowledge that for me, I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, traditional custodians who have never ceded sovereignty of the land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. You might want to put in the chat what land you are on. But I think when we're thinking about climate change, it's really important to have this acknowledgement of country, remembering that the Indigenous people have been on this land and cared for this land for 70,000 years, and the terrible damage that is going to be done to that land through climate change, and also the way for many Indigenous people that they're going to be very badly impacted by climate change. So that's a further injustice. Let me just start with a few words about me and about how I came to be concerned about climate change. So for a start, I'm a mother and a grandmother, and in a way that's all that needs to be said. I'm desperately concerned about the well-being of my kids and my grandkids. But besides that, I spent my career, as Melissa said, researching children's development, really trying to understand how things might go wrong for them, So we've looked at the development of anxiety and depression, of antisocial behaviour, doing poorly at school, substance use, all sorts of things. But also we've looked at what helps things to go well for kids, how to help them to be well adjusted. And we've looked at characteristics of them themselves, as well as things in their families, in their schools, in their communities, and their broader environment in trying to understand this. So the basic thrust has been, how can we best support kids to be well adjusted so they can live well, love well, work well, play well, and contribute well to their society. But as I became more aware of the reality of the climate crisis, I began to ask myself, really, what is the point of all this knowledge that I'm trying to acquire? Because things are going to change so radically for kids if we don't get on top of the climate crisis. Their lives are going to be, their very existence is under threat. So now I spend much of my time reading, thinking, talking, writing, and researching around the issues that I'm going to talk about today. So what I'll try to do in this little talk is talk a little bit just about how we are already seeing the effects of climate change and what a serious threat it does pose to the next generation. Then we know that most kids know about and are worried about climate change. How are they responding to this climate crisis? I'll talk about that a bit and what the research says about that. Then I'll talk a bit about, spend most of my time about talking about how we as parents and other caregivers, teachers, grandparents, etc., how we can best support them. And there'll be 4 main points that I want to make there. And then I'll sort of nuance that by taking age into account. So I'll talk about little kids and older kids. And you'll find that a theme that comes up a lot in what I'm talking about is the importance of helping kids to do something. You'll hear me say more than once, the best antidote to anxiety is action. And I'll talk about how this important is to have this sense of agency or efficacy for their positive development. And then I'll try to draw the links, given where we are now in time, in the COVID pandemic. I'll try to draw parallels and links between the COVID and the climate crisis throughout the talk, but I'll try to end with a little bit more about what I think we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's basically what I'm trying to cover today. So just to start off with, first, a quick reminder about the situation that we're facing. I suspect that you don't really need this, because the climate science is actually very well established and pretty straightforward, but I think it's always worth reminding ourselves. So the basic fact is that the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are now higher than they have been for 2.6 million years. So the top graph here shows is on a scale of 300 years, and it shows how levels of carbon dioxide were pretty stable, started to go up during the Industrial Revolution, and then started to go steeply up after the Second World War. So I'm quite confronted by the knowledge that most of this problem of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that we have now has occurred during my lifetime. I find that quite challenging. This bottom graph is on a much bigger scale. It's 800,000 years, and it shows how levels of carbon dioxide have gone up and down over time, but then over the last 70 years have absolutely skyrocketed. So scientists used to think that 350 parts per million was about the safe limit. We crossed that ages ago. We crossed 400 parts per million in 2013, and now we're at 416.8. I checked just a few days ago. I hoped it might be coming down a bit with the pandemic and less industrial activity, but it's still going upwards. So the last time it was as high as this was well before there were humans on the planet, and there were forests growing in Antarctica. It puts in context a bit. And then the second fact that we know is that temperatures, land and sea temperatures, have gone up in tracking that increase in carbon dioxide. So the latest estimate is that we're at about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming from pre-industrial times. So I'm sure you know that carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases act like a blanket. The heat from the sun can come in, but it can't escape again through these gases in the atmosphere. So I think we're getting used to broken temperature records. The last 5 years were the hottest 5 years on record. January this year was the hottest January on record. It was 20 degrees in the Antarctic. That's ridiculous in February. And they're now predicting that 2020 will be the hottest year on record, even though as we shiver here in Melbourne, it might not feel like that. And then I guess the third fact is, where do these greenhouse gases come from? And basically they come from how we live our lives every day. So basically from our mining, extraction and use of fossil fuels, oil, gas and coal, and using it to make energy in our industrial processes of all sorts, in the way we travel, in all ways, from our industrial scale agriculture, particularly meat production, from things like burning crops, from deforestation and burning of forests, and now particularly through these awful feedback loops, like as the permafrost in the Arctic melts, it releases a whole lot of methane. So although there are lots of great initiatives happening everywhere, looking around us, I think we have to admit that we're mostly continuing with business as usual in terms of how we produce our energy, how we travel, except when there's a pandemic, of course, how we produce our food, and generally how we live our lives. So many of us are making small changes in our lives, but our governments are certainly not making the really massive, radical, speedy changes that they need. But I think one of the learnings from COVID-19 is that governments can make big changes fast, and so can we. And that's a really important learning. But globally, we're still increasing our release of these gases, not decreasing it. And I think just looking around us, we have to realize that the Earth is already, with only 1.1 degree of heating, the Earth is already too hot. So we're seeing sea level rises resulting in a whole lot of coastal devastation and whole island populations having to find somewhere that they've lived for generations, finding somewhere else to live. We're seeing droughts and high temperatures resulting in lots of climate refugees in their hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and many, many millions more predicted. We're seeing extreme weather events of all sorts increasing in their frequency and their ferocity: floods, fires, cyclones, droughts, the whole works. In terms of the natural world, we've had the great sadness of watching the bleaching of our Great Barrier Reef and all those complex ecosystems that it supports. And then, of course, we've had the reality check of our awful, horrendous Black Summer fires. It's not right to call it Black Summer, really, because the first fires started at the end of winter and they went right through to the autumn. But, you know, thousands of homes and livelihoods destroyed, 19 million hectares of land burned. That's bigger than many European countries. And 20% of our forests burned, the homes to so many animals. So predictions of 1 billion animals having lost their lives and many others now threatened with extinction, many species threatened with extinction. It's really hard to get our heads around figures like this, but it really does remind us that we are already at the start of cataclysmic climate change. And we know that we only have this decade in which to do something about it, to reduce emissions, carbon emissions, to as close to zero as we can, and to start drawing down that excess carbon dioxide that's already there in the atmosphere. And that means huge changes by our governments at all levels, as well as in each of our lives, both as consumers and citizens. And we have to find a way to look after our kids, knowing that this is the reality. But, and this is a very big but, we do have to remind ourselves that we do have the technological solutions. We do know how to stop carbon emissions with all the things that I'm sure you know about: renewable energy, public transport, electric cars. We also know how to bring down the excess carbon dioxide that is there in the atmosphere. This book, Drawdown, is a great one to summarize the 100 best techniques or technologies we could use. And of course, lots of good things are happening at a local level, sometimes at a city level, sometimes even at a national level, that we can show our kids. Lots of good examples we can show them of solar panels on houses, on wind farms, communities getting together to reduce their carbon footprints, sharing food locally, farmers changing the way in which they do their farming, and so on. I don't know how many of you have seen the good Australian movie 2040, which talks about these, and there's another really good French one called Demain, or Tomorrow, which is, I think, even better. It's worth looking those out. I'm sure the library could help, Melissa, if it's hard to get to. And I think a lot of these examples show how changing to a net zero carbon emissions economy and society can actually build more healthy, cleaner, greener, more interconnected, more peaceful, and more resilient communities. So all that's missing really is the will to take political action at the scale and at the speed that's needed. And really, in democracies like Australia, in the end, that comes down to us demanding our governments to take the action that's needed. So let me turn some of that sort of reality check about what we're facing. Let's turn now to how climate change is already impacting on kids and young people, and how it increasingly will do so, and how our kids are responding. And I want to just talk for a tiny bit about kids in the developing world, the majority world, the global south, whatever you like to call it, but where 85% of the world's children live, and where they're already experiencing serious climate change. So kids are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than adults. The World Health Organization estimates that kids will suffer 80% of the deaths, the injuries, the illnesses associated with climate change. And that's because they're in that stage of rapid early growth. Their neural systems, their immune systems are not yet fully developed. They have more direct contact with the ground, so they can pick up toxins and bacteria more easily. And of course, they're dependent on adults. So if those adults are absent or highly stressed or ill or whatever, kids' well-being suffers. So they're more likely to suffer the deaths and injuries that come about through climate-related disasters like floods and fires and so on. And also from the longer-term things like we already know that malaria and dengue fever are increasing their range as temperatures increase. And heat-related illnesses of many kinds are becoming more common as temperatures rise and rainfall patterns change. And then things like malnutrition and diarrhea that are already big killers will get more as water shortages, food shortages, the forced migration, things like that occur. And of course, kids are likely to experience this more than once across their lives. It's likely to be a recurring thing, so the effects accumulate over time. So this graph is from a great UNICEF publication called Unless We Act Now. And it's really talking about how climate change will increase the inequalities between those who have and those who have not, increase those inequalities even more. So this particular graph is talking about drought. So we have a kid from a wealthier family. So you might be thinking about developing countries versus developed countries like Australia, or just thinking about poorer and wealthier kids in our own communities. But in the case of a severe drought, kids from wealthier families, their families can still migrate more safely to get out. They might still suffer during a drought, but they can more safely migrate. Even when food prices hit the roof, they can still afford to buy food. Even when clean water is in short supply, they can still get access to it. Even when hospitals and health systems are under stress, they can still get access to healthcare. They're more likely to be able to find shelter from the heat and dry and everything else. And really importantly, they're more likely to be able to keep their kid in school. But a kid from a poorer family, none of those things apply. So they find themselves on this downwards trajectory with all of these things adding up on top of each other to long-term deprivations or even lifelong disabilities and disadvantage. So I think it's worth just bearing this in mind when we're thinking about how we can support our own children. So let me turn now to mental health, which is more my area of expertise. And here we need to think about it in two ways. We need to think about kids who've gone through directly experiencing climate-related disasters like floods, fires, cyclones, etc., and then kids who just know about it through the media and so on. So if you look at kids who've actually been through climate disasters, the research shows that their rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms go up, so they get much more disrupted. They might act out, they might be very clingy and so on. Rates of anxiety and depression go up. Many of them have trouble sleeping. And then we have cognitive and learning problems. It's harder for them to focus, to stay on task, harder for them to take in new knowledge. And if it isn't the first disaster they've experienced, then those emotional reactions tend to be stronger. But the good news is that assuming that kids have got enough emotional support and social support and that they can go back to their routines quite quickly, most kids show amazing resiliency and they recover from those sorts of effects from short-term problems. In a way, what is more problematic is this sort of vicarious experience of climate change. So most of our kids haven't yet had direct experience of a climate-related disaster. The worst most of us have experienced have been the smoke from those awful fires and all those distressing images of suffering and destruction. But surveys from around the world show that most kids know about climate change and are worried about how it will impact upon their future lives. So the rates of worry seem to be increasing. In 2013, a survey in UK found that 74% of 11 to 16-year-olds were really worried. The rates from more recent surveys are in the 80s. One survey in Australia last year found 89% of kids were really worried about how it would affect their future. So it's really the majority of kids who are showing worry. Those data come from sort of ticker box surveys, you know, how much do you agree with this? How strongly do you feel about that? But if you do in-depth interviews with kids one-on-one, it is very common for really deep feelings of grief and loss, of anxiety, fear, anger and frustration at the adult world for not doing anything about this, and these deep feelings of helplessness, despair and hopelessness, which are a real worry. How can we expect our kids to invest in the future and to think about their careers and their future relationships if they're really feeling hopeless and helpless about how climate change will impact upon them? So those sort of fears have been, or reactions have been dubbed eco-anxiety, and that's become a bit of a buzzword. And it's really just a shorthand term to cover all these things. It's not a diagnosis. And it's important to remember that these fears are not irrational or illogical. They are based on what they know is happening. And they can be really useful in terms of motivating us into action, but they also can be very painful and uncomfortable and distressing, and sometimes disabling and paralyzing, and really hard for us as adults to watch our kids dealing with. So what then can we do to support our kids? Well, there are four main things that I'm going to talk about, we as parents and as teachers and as grandparents and so on. And the first thing is to listen to them, and especially to their feelings. Some kids will talk about their feelings very freely, and sometimes even rather too much so, when they say, "Oh, I hate my brother," and so on. And you don't need to make special efforts to help them express their feelings. But other kids feel shy or silly about admitting to feeling concerned about things. Some boys in particular think it's not cool to show that you care. And some kids think that adults aren't interested in their feelings anyway. I was involved in a youth social justice advisory group last year. And when I asked this big group, do you think adults listen to kids? There was this resounding no from the whole crowd, the whole group of them. And then, of course, there are kids who don't really think much beyond their immediate circumstances, their immediate lives, and they are genuinely unconcerned. But the research would suggest that they are in a minority. So I expect most of us have learned about how to communicate about our kids in difficult times through this pandemic. I think with COVID-19, we've asked about and validated kids' feelings. We've said, you know, how are you feeling about this? Yes, it is scary. But then we've reassured them about adults' responsibility and care. So we and all the health professionals are all working really hard to make sure you stay safe. And these are steps that we need in this first stage of climate communication as well. We need to find and make opportunities to, for example, when there's something on TV about climate change or whatever, or when they ask a question to say, is climate change something you worry about? How do you feel when you see these images of koalas with burnt feet or polar bears with no ice to live on or whatever? And then turn that into a supportive conversation. So Scott Morrison told us that kids were suffering from needless anxiety. I think that was at the time of the school strikes. I think every psychologist and probably every parent, anyone who works with kids, know that the worst thing we can do when kids have got strong feelings is to dismiss those feelings. So instead, we need to validate them. We need to say, yes, it makes sense that you're worried. It is a big problem. And maybe you can say, I'm worried about it too. You can say, I understand that you feel angry with my generation for doing so little about this. And you can say, yeah, it makes sense that you feel a bit helpless, don't quite know what to do about this. And then we have to avoid that tendency to say, but don't worry, everything will be all right. Everything will be fine, don't worry. But we do need to add to this messages of hope and action that I'll talk about in the next slide. And we do need to make sure that they know that they are loved and safe in the here and now. So the second thing that I think we need to do is to build their knowledge. So I guess with COVID-19, most of us have asked our kids what they know and we've built their knowledge. What have you heard about COVID-19? Let's find out some more. Let's see what the scientists are saying about this. And we're all often tempted to hide unpleasant truths from our kids. But really, when it's all over the media, when they're experiencing it themselves, we can't keep this from them. And in fact, the Convention on the Rights of the Child says that kids have a right to know about things that are going to affect their future and to be involved in decisions about those things. So I think we shouldn't shy away from dinner table conversations about climate change, from asking, what have you heard about climate change? And answering their questions honestly, even if that answer is, well, I don't actually know, let's find out together. Let's go and do some research together. It's also true, but of course you need to answer those taking age into account, and I'll talk about that soon. Some kids think that the whole world is going to burst into flames or that all of Hobson's Bay is going to go underwater really fast. So it's really important that we ask the question so we know they have that misunderstanding and we can correct it and say, no, it's not going to be as quick as that. That's not really how it's going to be. So I think it's really important that we share knowledge or find out together, depending on how much you know yourself, but not only just about the awful things that might happen with climate change, but also about its causes and about what we need to do to stop it from getting worse. Okay, then the third thing is building what I like to call realistic hope. I think that's a really important role for parents and others with kids. So with COVID-19, we've said, yes, it is a big problem, but we do know what to do, and we can and will get on top of this like we've got on top of other pandemics and other big problems. And so it is also with climate change. We need to acknowledge that it's a huge and urgent problem, but then say, but we do know most of what we need to do, and we're finding new ways of approaching it all the time. There are new inventions all the time, new ideas all the time. Lots of good people are working on it, not only the climate scientists and the engineers, but the people who are going out on the streets to try to make our politicians do the right thing, and so on and so forth. Really important to remind them we've solved big problems before. Think about slavery, think about women's suffrage, women's vote. think about the civil rights movement, think about the environmental things. Like, I don't know if any of you are old enough to have been around at the time of the fight to save the Franklin River. And then we can point out that in solving all of those problems, people power was really important. It was the many, many, many people getting out there and raising their voices, doing what they can in where they are to push for change. So we need to really build their belief in the power of individuals to make a difference. So we can talk about Nelson Mandela. We can talk about Greta Thunberg, the Swedish school striker. And we need to talk about how people together have made a difference. So we can talk about the Franklin Dam campaign, or we can talk about how the people power movement in the Philippines overthrew the very corrupt Marcos regime. So there's lots we can do in order to build this sense of hope. Not a Pollyanna-ish, everything will be all right, but we can get on top of this. There's the reason to be hopeful. Then the fourth step is to build their capacity to take action, help them to do something. And one very good reason for that is that it's often the very best way of reducing anxiety on the source of a problem is to take action on it. So as I said, I'm always saying the best antidote to anxiety is action. So with COVID-19, we have said there are things you can do to keep safe and to keep other people safe. You know, wash your hands, keep your distance, wear your mask, cough into your elbow. There are things they can do, and then they feel a bit more in control. So an important way for kids to learn for us as parents is for us to be good role models. So when you take the compost out, say, I feel good doing this because it's putting the good in the food into the soil instead of it going into a rubbish tip and becoming methane, which is making the earth too hot. When you take the train to work, explain why you're doing it. When you refuse to wrap their lunches in plastic, say why you're doing that. And find fun things to do together. There's so many good things that we can be doing together to address climate change. And in that, I think we need to be careful. It's really easy to think of kids just as the victims of climate change, the ones who are going to suffer all these extreme weather events and these other consequences of climate change. But we really need to think of them as problem solvers who have a right to be involved, like the Convention on the Rights of the Child says. So we need to see them that way. They need to see themselves that way. And so they can think about their own behaviour as consumers, so what they buy, how they use energy, all those sorts of things. They can think about that, but you can also help them to think of themselves as members of society, as citizens, and build their understanding of how they can actually influence decision makers and influence the way in which we do things, which again will vary depending on the kid's age. But you can start on that very early on. So there might be things they do at home, encourage you to do at home. There might be things they do in the shopping centre, the things that they try to get done at school, whatever it happens to be. And then because addressing climate, something as big as the climate crisis is really hard, emotional work and altogether, it's really good if kids can see how it's fun to actually work together with other people. It's not only fun, you learn a lot more, and what you do is a lot more effective. So those are the four big things. Let's now nuance that a bit by thinking about that for kids of different ages. Oh no, before that. I, with my colleagues at the Australian Psychological Society, found that lots of parents were finding difficulty in knowing how to talk to kids. So we developed this little booklet, which is up there on the screen. And I think Melissa's got a link that takes you to this and various other resources. And a lot of what I'm saying now is covered in those booklets. And there's a bit more that I won't have time to talk about in there. So you might want to download those booklets.
So I've just posted the link to that booklet in the chat, Anne, and I'll post the other few links that you sent. I'll post them in there as well. So everybody, you just need to download them before you hang up this event tonight.
Thanks.
Otherwise, I can email them out as well.
Thanks, Melissa. So really what we're trying to do with all of that communication is to build that sense of efficacy, that there's things that we can do. So if we all act as little fish and try to run away from this great big problem of climate change or ignore it individually, we're likely not to succeed. But if we gang up on the great big problem together to address it, then we have the chance of actually having success. So now let me move to talking about kids at different ages, and let's start off with kids of preschool to early primary school age. So in all of this, talking to kids of any age really, but particularly with little kids, when we are engaging in these conversations, our aim is not to scare them, but rather to acknowledge that they probably already know enough to be worried, and if they don't now, they soon will, and that they have a right to know, and that our responsibility is not only to do all we can to keep them safe, but also to help them cope with what they know. And it's exactly the same as what happened with COVID-19. They needed to know a bit about it, and they needed to know that we are there to keep them. We're fulfilling our responsibility to keep them safe and protect them the best we can. So saying that they have a right to know doesn't mean that we give them a lecture on climate science. What it means is we are guided by them and we take it gently. And with little kids, giving simple answers to their questions is a good way to go. So, and always trying to pair that with something to do. So, for example, if they see some footage of the fires and they say, why are there so many fires? You say, because it's been so hot and dry out there, because the earth is getting hotter. It's sad, isn't it? Shall we plant a tree to make up for all those trees that got burnt? Shall we send a letter or a drawing or some money to the people who lost their houses or who are looking after the hurt animals? If you're in town and they see a rally going on, why are all those people carrying banners? Say, well, they're trying to stop a new coal mine because burning coal makes a gas called carbon dioxide that's making the earth too hot. When we get home, shall we try make a poster about that? Something like that. So whatever questions they come up with, finding simple answers. And the other thing is using everyday things as teachable moments. As I was saying before, it's really important that you're a good role model of caring for the environment and reducing your own carbon footprint and explaining why you do the pro-environmental things that you do. I gave the example of taking the compost out before, taking the train and not buying things that are wrapped in plastic and so on. And then they get a sense that people are not helpless, but there are things that each of us can do. And I think it's really important not to be afraid to set high standards for the family's behaviour. To say, in this house, we recycle because blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure you know all the blah, blah, blahs, the reasons why we do that. In this house, we don't buy plastic bottles because it'll end up in the oceans, etc. We turn the lights out when we leave a room because we don't eat much meat because. So all of these things, just make it clear about what the reasons are, but let them lead into conversations. And if they've got more questions to ask, you can then respond to those questions. Whenever we can, we walk or ride a bike or take the public transport rather than taking our car because, and give them all these examples. Another really important thing is to give kids plenty of relaxed, unstructured time in natural environments, natural places, and helping them to really see and fall in love with nature and feel comfortable in it. We know that doesn't just happen naturally with maturation. We know it comes through experience. And the kids need to have time being in nature, you know, watching where the ants go, making mud pies, climbing trees, playing hidey in the bush, whatever it is, feeling comfortable being in nature. So then they feel comfortable or get a recognition of being part of nature, being with nature. And that's what then motivates them to want to work for nature, to protect nature. So things like bush kinders and nature play are all really good for that. And all, of course, it depends where you live and how close you are to bits of the natural environment. And then the sort of things that you can do with little kids are often around nature and environmental protection. Kids vary a huge amount, as you know. So some kids are really turned on and really want to go up there and talk to the people in the supermarket about not wrapping the food in plastic, and want to have posters up on their house, and they really want to get very active and to take part in strikes and things. Other kids do not. And for those kids, I think small local actions are really what are helpful. So making a veggie garden and talking about why you're doing it. Helping with planting and weeding activities down at your local creek or along the beach. Helping them make stickers to put on their school bag, which might say, I love trees, or it might say no more coal or whatever. But little things. And of course, this is a wonderfully creative age. There are so many things of the creative things they do where you can steer that in a climate direction to help them sort of learn and feel confident about helping to protect their environment and protect the climate in what they're doing anyway. And if you run out of ideas, you'll find online all sorts of compendiums of ideas of things you can do. On the website that Melissa has given you, there's also this little brochure of 101 things you can do to address climate change, which would give you a few more ideas about things you can do with your kids as well. So that's some ideas about talking to kids, little kids, and engaging them around climate change. We're talking about late primary and secondary school children. Most of what I've said about younger kids still applies, so those are still really relevant. But on top of that, it's very common for kids of this age to know more than their parents do, and they often are very engaged in wanting to know about climate change, and they want to have their ideas, their knowledge respected. So it's really important that we take their ideas seriously. Obviously, at this age, they can understand more complex explanations, so they can see how what they do at a local level is going to affect the global things. And they can also see how what's happening at a global level, increases in temperature, are filtering down to what's happening in their local environment. They also can see how the past is leading to what's happening, things that have happened in the past, all of our overexploitation of coal and so on, is leading through to the situation we're in now and is going to lead to the future, and how what we do now in the present is going to affect the future. So there's lots of opportunities for really good discussions and research and reading together and finding out more. This is an age where kids often care a lot about fairness and justice. How many of you are here rather more often than you'd want? But that's not fair. And for a lot of kids, those feelings of fairness and justice are very strong around as they become aware of how the impact of climate change on the developing world, the injustices involved there, on Indigenous peoples, on nature, and on future generations. And these are really important values. These are the bigger than self, or self-transcending sorts of values of showing empathy, showing a global worldview. Fairness and justice are just really important values, pro-environmental values. So really show that you value that. Say, I really like it that you care so much about these things. That's really great. Then, of course, they're very sensitive to hypocrisy. So practicing what you preach at this age is even more important than with younger kids in terms of reducing your carbon footprint. They're also very peer-oriented. So helping them to find friends who share their concerns is really important, and also encouraging them to join groups. So there are groups like the School Strike for Climate group, and there's the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. I've got websites for them at the end of this, I think. So encourage them to join groups. And finally, they are very action-oriented. And I would say it's really important to support their activism. Activism is good for the planet. It's also good for their mental health. There's another aspect too. I don't know how we're going with time. we're getting short of time, aren't we, Melissa? I better hurry up. So,
oh, it's only just gone 7 o'clock, so I think you're doing fine, Anne.
okay, I won't spend much time on this, but I think there's another thing that we need to think about as parents and teachers about how we need to be preparing kids for the big changes ahead of them. So even if we keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees, this generation of kids are still going to suffer a lot of climate impacts from the things that are already sort of set in stone that are going to happen. It's going to be a much more disrupted climate that they experience. So they're likely to have more extreme weather events that they have to go through. There are likely to be a lot of climate refugees coming in from parts of Australia that become too hot and too dry to be habitable, but also from Pacific Islands, from Asia and so on. And all of that takes adjusting and coping with. And then we'll only stay at 1.5 degrees if we transition fast to a net zero emissions economy. And that means huge changes in the way in which we work, we live, we travel, and everything else. So kids need to be really adaptable. And I don't have time to go. This is something else we've done another little booklet on, which is, as is up there, which you might like to get. But the sort of things that we talk about, I'm going to go through this really, really fast because I've got more I want to say. But there are things about their own skills like self-regulation, being able to manage their anxieties, being able to manage their behaviour, the bigger than self values I've talked about, coping not by ignoring or running away or taking substances or getting aggressive, but by focusing on the problem, focusing on the meaning they can make out of the situation they're in. Interpersonal skills like cooperation and conflict resolution are going to be really important. Lots of opportunities for conflict, lots of need for people to be working together. Knowing how to make relationships with peers, with families, in workplaces to support you is really important. And then this really important category of being engaged in their society and their community. So taking pleasure in supporting their community, being a joiner, believing in the power of people to make change, knowing how to influence decision makers, and having a global sense of the world. And I would make the bold claim that this is actually more important than the STEM skills, you know, the science, technology, engineering, and maths that we're always told our kids need. I suspect these skills will actually be even more important to help them to adapt to the things that are ahead of them. Let me just say a little bit more about agency, which I've talked about before, about the importance of taking action. And agency really is just a fancy word for kids believing that they can make changes and knowing how to make those changes in their world. And it's one of the most critical components for kids coping with what's ahead of them. So this graph shows levels of child agency. So the first one is knowledge. I'm learning about disasters and how to stay safe. That's the area that we've mostly been working on with COVID-19. But above that is voice. I'm speaking out about disaster risk. So maybe I'm looking at what areas of Hobson's Bay would get flooded if the sea level rose and thinking about how protection could be put in there. And then action to protect. I'm helping to protect my community. Action to influence. I'm speaking out about things and trying to get people to decision makers to change their mind. And then finally, action to transform, making a real difference. So all of these areas of agency are really valuable, and kids might go on a pathway from the small things to the bigger things. But all of them are really valuable areas of action. And of course, in terms of action to transform, we have the wonderful example of Greta Thunberg, who, can you believe that she started the school strike for action in Sweden less than 2 years ago? So much has happened in that time. And she said these very wise, bold, brave things to the world leaders. She says at the World Economic Forum, I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear that I feel every day. And at the climate change conference, she says, you say you love your children above all else, but yet you're stealing their futures in front of their very eyes. So she's been very brave, determined, and a very remarkable young woman. And showing how her words and ideas resonated so strongly with so many kids who hadn't yet found their voice all around the world. just 3 months later, we had 30,000 kids on the streets right across Australia in all these strikes led by kids. So the kids did all the organising. They worked with the police. They worked with the media. They worked on the safety aspects. They did so much, you know, obviously with some support from adults, but amazing skills that they learned through doing this. And then there have been 2 more strikes since then, with the one in September last year, there being 4 to 6 million kids across the globe coming out and demanding action to save their future. So I think these young people are really showing their persistence and determination, their all sorts of skills, their self-efficacy, and a lot of the other things that we think they're going to need to cope with what's ahead of them. And they're also very articulate and very funny and very clever. And I really like some of these posters. So some people have resisted kids going on strike, saying they should stay at school and learn their 3 Rs, as if one day off school is going to make such a difference. But I think that's wrong. Of course, not all kids will want to go on strike. It won't be right for every kid. Not everyone's going to be feel like safe or even the need to do it. But for kids who want to, I think it is developmentally appropriate and psychologically sound for them to be turning their attention out to this great big problem that's going to shape their future and doing what they can to ensure that they and others do have a safe future, and that they learn many new strengths and skills through doing so. And it's also very clear that it helps them manage their anxiety. Talking to these school strikers, many of them talk about how they were just about paralysed with fear and anxiety until they started to take action. But now, working together with others, finding others around them who feel the same way, getting the ear of the adult world, they feel much more hopeful. They feel that we can actually make change by working together, and they've transformed their anxiety into action. So I think supporting this young people's agency is a really important role for us as parents and others caring for kids. Of course, there are lots of other things that kids can do too, and this is a bit of just flagrant advertising on my part, but I'm a member of a group called Psychologists for Peace, and we have an annual Youth for Peace award, and this year we've decided that the climate crisis is the overarching peace issue that we're dealing with in the world today. So we are asking kids aged anywhere between 12 and 24 to come together in teams of however big they want, from 3 to whatever, and to think of a group that they really want to get acting on climate change, doing things that they're not doing now, and to come up with a pitch to try to get them to change their minds using a whole lot of psychological resources we give them. So we'd love it if you have kids who you think might be interested in this, or if you wanted to help promote this to kids that you might know about. We think that'll, especially for kids who are in lockdown still, we think it'll be a really nice thing for them to do. So now let me just end with just a few thoughts about what we've learned through the COVID-19 crisis. As I've said, I think it's taught us lots of things, and it's also created real opportunities for change. So I think we have learned about supporting and communicating with our kids in difficult times, and so we can now use those skills to talk to kids around the climate crisis. But at the end of the day, though, our main responsibility, in my mind, as parents of us, as parents and grandparents and others, is to make sure that they actually have a livable planet. Nothing else really matters. That's the conclusion that I came to for myself around my career researching children's development. And that puts the onus on us to take action to make our politicians do the things that are needed. So we learned that global problems need global cooperation, global action. We've learned that governments can listen to the science, even if they haven't listened to the climate science up to now, but they should, that they can take emergency action, and that people can change their behaviour fast when the need is explained to them. So I think it's been remarkable. The Australian government has responded with appropriate urgency and scale to the pandemic. And on the whole, we praised and supported them because they explained the problem to us as guided by the scientists. They engaged us in helping to solve it, and they put aside their political rivalries and they put people first. And now we need to see the same emergency approach to action on the climate crisis. So that telling the truth has really built our faith and hope in what might happen. So now I think we have a fantastic opportunity as we move into the recovery phase to build back better, to make the Australian economy fit for purpose for the 21st century, not just going back to the 20th century technologies, and address the climate emergency in order to create a cleaner, fairer, healthier society and a livable planet for our kids. There's been some fantastic thinking going on during the pandemic by all sorts of groups. One of the really good ones is Beyond Zero Emissions, that have got a million jobs plan. I wonder if I put that in here. No, I didn't. But it's worth looking at.
I'll find the link and share that, Anne.
And Climate Works have one as well. And other people have said all this much better than I have. So Catherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist, says, what really matters is the same for all of us. It's the health and safety of our friends, our family, our loved ones, our communities, our cities, and our country. That's what the coronavirus threatens, and that's exactly what climate change does too. And then Mahmoudi, a professor at the University of Maryland in the US, says the crisis calls for non-partisan, united action based on scientific evidence and ethical considerations. It demands moral courage. The same is true of climate change. And then Andrew Steer, the head of the World Resources Institute, says, as the world looks to recover from the current health and economic crises, we face a choice. We can pursue a modern, clean, healthy energy system, or we can go back to the old polluting ways of doing business. We must choose the former. So really, what I would like to end with is encouraging you not only to support your kids as they grapple with the threat the threat that climate change poses to their futures, but also to take action yourself to make sure that they do indeed have a green, healthy, sustainable planet to live on. So I will leave it there. Oh, at the bottom here are 3 groups that you might be interested in. The bottom 2 are for kids, if kids want to get involved in groups, the School Strike for Climate movement and the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. But if you're feeling like you want some more support and to be engaged with parents who are really concerned about climate change, the assist group Australian Parents for Climate Action is also a really great one to look into. And I will leave it there, Melissa.
I posted in the chat a link to the Hobsons Bay Kids Climate Action Team. So that's a group of local kids who are working together. And I also put Transitions Hobsons Bay in. So that's more of an adult organisation who are working on some of those climate change issues as well. So they're probably two of our most local groups who are tackling some of these issues too.
So I will stop sharing now, okay?
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Anne. Now, we would love to get some questions from those of you who are out there, if anybody has any. So feel free to, if you wanted to pop up your hand up or raise, I can see, so I'm just looking to see, I think, Alison, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Anne. That was a really great presentation and lots of suggestions about how to help your children or teenagers that I'm interested in. I guess for my daughter, there's been a confluence of COVID-19 and climate change. So even though she has been active and sees herself and us contributing to things that would reduce climate change, there's still a feeling of the world changing too much, that it's not enough, it's just a drop in the ocean, and it's those feelings of despair that you want to help and you can't other than listen. That's the part that I find challenging, and it's not all the time, but there's certainly moments where that's how she's feeling, that's not enough. Whatever we do, it's not enough.
Yep. I think it's a feeling that just about everybody who's involved in the climate movement experiences from time to time, and it is hard. And for me, finding the joining with others who feel the same way as me is my way of dealing with this, and I know that's the same for many of the teenagers that I know. So for them, being part of the school strikes group has been amazingly helpful. For me, I'm a member of the Melbourne Climate Choir, and singing songs for climate is with other lovely people is very restorative, I guess.
Yeah.
Being part of my local climate action group, so I'm part of Darebin Climate Action now, and again working with them, at different levels. So we're working with our local council, which was the first council in the world to declare a climate emergency, yay! But working with them and to try to keep them doing as much as they possibly can is one of the things that I find good. So really, I think to say, yes, it is hard, but, keep on reinforcing, but we have got through big problems before.
Yeah.
We can't, there's so many people out there that are working on this. Our little bit drop in the ocean still does make a difference. Trying to get I guess one of the things that I push a lot is with kids, and we were talking earlier about sustainability education. Sustainability education is often around the things that we do as consumers and how we change our lifestyles as consumers to reduce our carbon footprint. And that's really good and important. But at the end of the day, it's what we do as citizens that makes a difference. And so helping kids as well as modelling it ourselves, writing to our politicians, going to visit our politicians, writing to the papers, doing all of those citizen-based activities, I think is really important. And that sometimes can make kids feel, I certainly know the school strikers, the early ones in Castlemaine, their first action was to try to engage their local politicians. And they went up to Canberra and they met Bill Shorten. That turned out not to be very helpful, but since he then left. But they found that really empowering, I think, to be able to talk to politicians and to know that politicians knew how they felt. So that's not knowing your child. I understand and I sympathise, but I think action is really our only way forward. Really.
Thank you.
Do what we can. Yeah.
Lots of great suggestions there, so thank you very much. I'm really sorry though, I have to go, so I don't want to seem rude, like I just asked my question and left, but thanks so much, and thanks for organising it, Melissa.
Thanks for joining us tonight, Alison. We really appreciate it. And Alicia, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, I was going to, I guess, just ask about, there's so many, my daughter's just started prep, and we do a lot of things like, she has a lunchbox that's all unpackaged food or homemade food, and we ride to school as much as we can and that kind of thing. But what I'm finding now is we're talking about a lot of things like regarding race, regarding gender, regarding, people with two mums at home or two dads at home, or only a mum or only a dad. And then she's coming home with questions about things like homelessness as well. And I guess it's very easy to become overwhelmed with how many things we've got to talk to these kids about and prepare them for, and questions that their friends are asking or that they're talking with their friends about. And she goes to a Catholic school, so she's also coming home with questions about, the Catholic religion. So it's sort of like, and then we have friends who are other, or who follow other religions. So I guess, actually, I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but where is the balance with all of that? Or like a lot of the things you talked about, I can relate to, like we've done a lot of learning about, and especially learning about, at kinder, she learned a lot about first peoples, not so much at school. So we did a lot of learning about that last year together. But it's a lot for a 5-year-old. And it's a lot for me as well. So I guess how do you sort of find a balance between all of that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think you should be very proud of having such a thoughtful, engaged little girl.
She certainly is.
I think telling her that you're really proud of her for thinking about all these things is one thing. I guess I can see how each one of those will be interesting conversations to have with her. I would make sure that she has enough tomfoolery fun in her life.
Yes.
not thinking about those things. Really, when you're talking about race and you can be celebrating different family forms, saying, isn't it great? We always talk about families as being just mum and dad, but that's not really true. There's families come in all sorts of shapes, and talk about examples where there've been lots of mums in a family and and so on, and that's all great. And the important thing is kids are cared for. It doesn't really matter who they're cared for by.
Yes, yeah, good point.
One person, two people, three people of whatever genders, etc. So I guess that's the sort of line I'd take around the gender things. About homelessness, I think you can say, yes, it's really sad that some people don't have houses, isn't it? What shall we do? And maybe she'd like to, she sounds like she's bright enough that she might like to write a letter to the Minister for Housing.
Yes. Well, and that's a good point, actually, because I think a lot of the things, she sort of brainstorms things that she can do or that our family can do. We can build houses for people. Yes. We can let people come and live with us.
Yes.
And sort of putting it that step further to politicians and that kind of thing.
Say this isn't our responsibility. We can give money to the people that we see or whatever, but it really has to be bigger than us. But we can influence those people. We can do our bit to make them do what needs to be done. So I guess I would do that. And I think that, again, action, doing something is just really great. And when they come up with actions that aren't realistic, like you handing your house over to a homeless family, having some tricks up your sleeve of other things you can do, which often are building those citizenship skills, even though she's only in prep.
Yes, good point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Look, no question from me. I just want to say thanks. It's been really good. And I guess while I know the reason I joined this, I don't have kids. I've got nephews. But some of the best stuff that I've seen is when the whole science, even just the non-scientific discussion, but just the complexity or the doom and gloom of climate isn't spoken about as much. And some of the things that you've spoken about tonight and the way it's framed, it shouldn't just be for kids. It should be for adults. So I think you said that a lot of the time adults, or the kids know more than the adults based on people at school they're hearing from or what they're learning. And I really think the more we can educate the masses on the simplistics of this and using the language that only kids would understand, because let's face it, most of the adults only understand that too. They're just too proud to acknowledge that. I think is really important. So no, it's great. Thank you.
So can I just ask, was it, do you think it's more education about the climate, the facts of climate change is what people need in your experience, that people don't know those basic facts? I find it just amazing that it's such simple facts. There's too much carbon dioxide. This is where it comes from. This is what it does.
Look, I think there's an aspect of there's definitely an educational aspect up front. But then it needs to be a solutions focus as well. It can't just be another, here's 10 problems, the world's going to end and everyone tunes out. Yeah. And it can't be too, look, I've heard carbon dioxide, Paris Agreement, carbon footprint way too much, that every time I do, apart from now that I'm in this space, I just mentally unsubscribe. I know it, but it's just not front of mind because I'm sick of hearing about it. Yeah. The one thing that unlocked it for me was a really simple statement that was, everything we buy has a hidden price tag on the environment, and that's carbon, the key contributor to climate change. And I could start visualizing it then. I saw these two price tags, a dollar price tag and then a carbon price tag on the things that I buy. And it made it real for me. And then I read on and it said, we can stop this thing if we all get our carbon footprint down to 2 tonnes per annum, the average Australian to 15 tonnes. And then I went, okay, it's great. There's a target. It doesn't sound easy, but if there's a target, we can do something. So I think it needs to be that sort of initial, very simplistic educational piece that helps visualise an invisible problem like climate change and carbon dioxide, but then also makes it really action-oriented to tell people, look, by doing three things, switching your energy, switching your banking, switching whatever, you can halve your carbon footprint. Oh, geez, in three, in the space of 15 minutes, I could do that, great. And then get them on that journey.
Yeah,
so no, I think this is great, so thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just looking through the comments, and Anne has just popped in the comments that she wants to say thank you to you, Anne. So Anne to Anne, thank you. And she was talking about the fact that the PowerPoint and the links have provided a wealth of support to assist her with her daughters, but also in her teaching career. And I think coming from a past teacher myself, I know I personally always felt the influence of the surrounds of a student, and how do you sometimes combat what a student's coming to school with already preconceived ideas, and how to kind of, break down some of those barriers without potentially getting in too much conflict with the education that they've had at home as well. So what would your suggestion be around that, Anne?
Well, I mean, that's what education is always about, isn't it? Is challenging either ignorance or preconceived ideas. So that's the challenge for teachers, I expect, all the time. I guess, well, it varies for different people, I suppose. That there can be project-based work is often really good, when they might do a project on the fires and why our massive fires, why they happened, what the multiple causes were for that. Or it might be much more local. Why are we getting different fish in the bay these days? What's happening there? And leading them into talking about warming temperatures and acidification and things like that. So where they see climate change happening in their local environment, and it brings it home. So that works, I think, for some kids. For some kids, doing stuff on the massive disinformation campaign, then the billions of dollars that were put in by the fossil fuel companies to create doubt about the science and to build belief that market forces will fix it all. I mean, that's just a really interesting story also, that might just help to get a more questioning frame of mind in kids' heads if they are very sort of fixed with a denialist or avoiding parents, climate avoiding. So, don't know. It's hard. I think depends on the age of the kids, depends on the particular background of the kids, and so on. But in my experience, project-based work where they're really getting into nitty-gritty with a small group and they can talk about it, especially if you can engineer that group so it includes some kids who are more in tune with the science, with those who are only just getting there.
Yeah,
Melissa,
I
sorry,
think they're great suggestions.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I've got to jump now at 7:30, but how do I access the recording? Because I was late to getting on and I missed the first 15 minutes.
So give me a couple of days and then we will have it. I'll link it to the Facebook post that of the event today, and it will also go on our YouTube page as well. So it will be up there. It just depends. I've got a bit on tomorrow, so it may not get up there tomorrow, but it should be up there by Friday.
Awesome. Sorry, I've got to run, guys, but thank you so much. That was really good.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Alicia, do you have another question? I can see your hand up.
Yeah, no, I was actually just going to say the question you had before about kids who may be going home to families who are not doing a whole lot of maybe talking about climate change or that kind of thing. I find that is sort of from we try and do our bit, but then extended family and friends and that kind of thing, that's sort of a barrier that we come across quite often. So that's really useful. I was just going to sort of make that connection that it sort of goes both ways. It's like the way to engage kids, but then also the way to engage like other members of family and that kind of thing, especially if they have, old habits or, generational differences or follow mainstream media a lot. So, yeah, I guess just connections.
Good. Yeah. I have been really impressed with some of my real environmentalist friends and how they've gone around their parenting. It sounds like you're doing an awful lot of that too, but being just very strong about what the culture of our family is. In our family, we do this and we take pride in doing this, and that's what makes us special. Is, you know, this is part of our identity, is to be doing these things. And I think that's made the kids much stronger and firmer in their beliefs and their ability to talk to their friends and other people and to start to draw them in.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have kids myself, but my good friend often says when her kids were young, that was very easy. Once they hit the pre-teen to the teens, that's when, you know, they want to just do and be what their friends are and fit in, and that's where they sort of start to struggle with those not being able to do some of the things that their friends are doing. So I think what you said earlier about connecting your kids with other like-minded families and kids was such a great suggestion.
Yeah. I certainly think with older kids getting involved in the school strike group and Australian Youth Climate Coalition and things like that, or more local groups, is a really great thing. Okay.
So I'm just looking in the comments again, Anne, and if you wanted to jump on and say something in your microphone, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, we'll just read out what you've popped in here. So this is an area of climate change that can feel all too overwhelming with kids, and just hearing that it's about starting small or with simplicity when very young and building upon that with knowledge, exposure and supportive material makes it tangible. I'd love to engage in further professional knowledge in this area. Can you suggest any other sessions just like or similar to this one?
Well, from what can I say? There's lots of resources out there. There's a lot more being written. When I started talking about this, I could find virtually no other psychologists or developmental people who are talking about this. But in the last few years, a lot more stuff is coming out. Do I know my friend and colleague Susie Burke often gives talks around this too, and she's fantastic. We've done a lot of writing together. She's actually the mother of Malou, who was one of the first of the school strikers up in Castlemaine. There's a group called Psychology for a Safe Climate, which have got some lovely materials. I would think actually probably the Australian Parents for Climate, what are they called? The Australian Parents for Climate Coalition that I had on my last slide, Melissa. You might find them really valuable. They're doing a lot of really good work. And they would be good contacts for thinking about other people who are doing similar stuff.
And they have a Facebook page as well, don't they?
Yes, they're mostly through their Facebook page. Yeah.
So Australian Parents for Climate Change, I think.
Can't be for climate change. People often say that it's the group for climate change. We're actually against climate change.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I can't remember quite what their Australian Parents
for Climate Action.
For Climate Action, yes. Yeah, that's what I would like them to be.
Makes so much more sense than my suggestion, Alicia. Thank you. And Anne's just apologising that her video and microphone aren't working, so she says thank you to you for your questions. I did actually also notice there's a few books coming out in the later part of this year around talking to kids about climate change. So I've got a few of them on my list to purchase in the library. And while I mentioned that earlier in the chat, I actually popped in some links for 2040 and Drawdown. So we have Drawdown available as an ebook as well as a physical book. We've got 2040, the DVD, but it's also available to stream through Beamer Films as well with your library membership. And then there's also a book in conjunction with that DVD that we have as well. So they're and their catalogue links are all in the chat up there as well.
And I think it would be great if you can see if you can get hold of this other one called Tomorrow or Demain, D-E-M-A-I-N, the French one.
So we do have that one as well. Let me find the link for that in there, because yes, we do. I've seen that one as well.
A very exciting little thing. It's a few years old now, but
it is. But I will pop the link to that one in there as well. Is there any other questions in there from anybody? No? Okay, well, if there isn't any other questions, it's probably about time for us to be finishing up anyway. So I would like to thank Anne for her time tonight. It's been an absolute wealth of knowledge. I don't have kids, I've said that already, but I got a lot of information out of that. I've got lots of nieces and nephews and lots of friends with kids, so I always try and influence them as much as I can. So thank you for all that information. Before we do go though, I do also want to mention some of our upcoming EnviroCentre events. So in just a couple of weeks, on Wednesday the 8th of July, we're actually going to have Jean Blakely, who's the founder and chief advocate of Drawdown Australia, and he's coming in to talk, well, so he's not coming in, we'll be going online to talk about some of the pathways that communities can take to achieve below zero emissions, so local action with a global impact. So it's coming up on Wednesday, 8th of July. It's a bit of an climate change focus going on at the moment, because then our next event on Wednesday the 5th of August, we're having Market Forces coming in to talk about ethical investing and how you can make sure that your super and your banking and all that is helping to address climate change, how you can invest wisely, ethically, and help you financially as well. So some great events coming up there, and they'll be available on our website to book as well. But thank you very much, Anne. Had an amazing evening, and thank you to everybody who joined us. We will hopefully see you at one of our next events coming up soon. But until then, have a good night. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks very much, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Anne.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See you later. See you later.
Bye.